All right, let's get into it. I want you to picture this. A long, narrow, unbelievably filthy room on a street in New York City called the Bowery, a place that really, against all odds, became the single most important incubator for a musical revolution that just changed everything. This is the story of CBGB.
So, to really get what happened inside this club, you first have to understand what was happening right outside its doors. See, the New York of the mid-70s, well, it wasn't the tourist hotspot you see today, not even close. The city was broke, it was dangerous, it felt like it was literally falling apart. All that optimism from the 60s had just vanished, leaving behind this gritty, cynical reality. And you know what? It was the perfect breeding ground for something raw, something angry, something new. And that's the real question, isn't it? How in the world does a cultural Big Bang, a moment that defines music for decades to come, erupt from the middle of a city that's literally crumbling? Well, it turns out you need a very specific recipe of desperation, a whole lot of creativity, and one very, very important rule. And the guy behind this whole recipe was a man named Hilly Kristal. In 1973, he decides to open a music club right in the middle of the Bowery. And you have to understand, at the time, the Bowery was New York's Skid Row, a street filled with flop houses and lost souls. He had a vision, for sure, but it wasn't for the music we now associate with the club at all. The club's full name was actually CBGB and OMFUG. Now, the CBGB part stood for Country, Bluegrass, and Blues. And the OMFUG part? That was Hilly's little inside joke, other music for uplifting gourmandizers. Basically for people who just devour music. And the incredible irony here is that the country, bluegrass, and blues thing, it never happened. Not really. Instead, the club became this magnet for every artistic misfit who was being totally rejected by the slick, overproduced arena rock of the time. So Hilly's personal taste in music, it didn't really end up mattering. What mattered, what would come to define the entire movement, was this one single policy he put in place. It was so simple, but for the time, it was absolutely radical. That's it, original music only. Now, think about that. In a city where nearly every bar band was a cover band just playing last year's hits, this was unheard of. This one rule transformed CBGB from just another dive bar into a genuine incubator. It literally forced bands to create, to invent, to find their own sound. It was the spark that lit the whole fuse. Okay, so the stage is set for pure originality. Who were the first ones to step up? Well, the early sound of the club was really forged by two pioneering bands who were in a lot of ways complete opposites. The first ones to really make a home there back in '74 were this group of kind of poetic, artsy rockers. And what's so fascinating is the contrast you see here. On one side, you've got Television. Their sound was complex, it was jagged, almost literary. And get this, one of their members, Richard Hell, with his torn-up clothes and safety pins, basically invented the punk look that Malcolm McLaren would later famously take to London. And then the Ramones walked in. They were the absolute total opposite of '70s rock. I mean, while bands like Led Zeppelin were playing 20-minute guitar solos, the Ramones were playing 20-minute sets. They were just this high-speed collision of bubblegum pop and raw distortion. And here's their real impact. They made music democratic again. The Ramones showed an entire generation of kids that you didn't have to be a technical guitar god. All you needed were 3 chords, something to say, and a really, really loud amp. But if you think the scene was just about that raw 3-chord punch, you'd be totally wrong. Pretty soon, the club was flooded by a wave of artists who brought this completely different energy. An intellectual, almost avant-garde vibe that proved punk was so much more than a simple stereotype. And just look at the incredible variety this brought to that little stage. You had the Talking Heads, who showed up from art school wearing like polo shirts, playing this incredibly nervous, funky, and super smart rock music. You had Blondie, who mixed that punk attitude with pop and disco and the cinematic glamour and became the first band from the scene to become massive global stars. And then you had Patti Smith, a poet first, a rock star second. She was the scene's spiritual core, It's high priestess, blending this high art literature with raw garage rock power. But here's what's so important to understand. CBGB was way more than just the music you heard on stage. It was the absolute center of an entire cultural ecosystem. It was a community that basically had to invent its own way of doing everything because the mainstream music industry wanted absolutely nothing to do with them. Seriously, think about this for a second. No internet, no social media. How did the scene even talk to itself? Well, through things like this, zines. Specifically, a magazine called Punk, which started in 1975 and literally gave the entire movement its name. These hand-stapled, photocopied pamphlets, they were the lifeline. They were the original blogs, the documentation of a revolution as it was happening. And all of this just fed into the real backbone of the whole era, the do-it-yourself ethic. The message was so clear, so powerful. Don't wait for a record label to come find you, start your own band. Don't wait for a magazine to write about you, start your own zine. You press your own records, you book your own shows. It was a total decentralization of power, and CBGB was its physical headquarters. But you know how these stories go. Nothing lasts forever. The very city that had allowed CBGB to even exist, a cheap, neglected, forgotten city, it started to change. And as New York changed, the fate of the club was pretty much sealed. By the 2000s, the Bowery wasn't Skid Row anymore. It was quickly becoming a luxury destination. A really bitter legal battle over rent kicked off in 2005, and despite this massive Save CBGB campaign, the club was forced to close. The final concert, in the most poetic way possible, was headlined by Patti Smith. She ended the entire night by reading out the names of all the musicians from the scene who had passed away. Hilly Kristal himself died the very next year. And this is the address today, 315 Bowery. It's a high-end men's clothing store now. It kind of stands as this strange, silent monument to a time when New York was dangerous, when creativity was cheap, and when the most important sounds in the entire world were blasting out of this one little room. So why do we still talk about it? Why does it still matter so much? Well, because its legacy it's everywhere. CBGB democratized art. It proved that passion was way more important than technical skill. It basically gave birth to the entire concept of indie music and self-promotion. Its fashion is still on runways today, and it proved that a single sweaty, rundown club could define the cultural identity of an entire city. Which kind of leaves us with this big final thought, doesn't it? The very conditions that created CBGB were economic collapse and urban decay. It thrived because the rent was dirt cheap, and frankly, nobody else wanted to be there. In the hyper-gentrified, incredibly expensive cities of today, could a place like this ever really happen again?